Happy Wednesday. Happy day one of the second 100 days of the Trump administration. I got a fascinating interview coming up today with a woman by the name of Jodi Vittori. She's a military veteran. She's a professor in practice for global politics and with a concentration on national security issues at Georgetown University. But she spent a lion's share of her career in the military, educated at the Air Force and Academy, and she's a specialist in kleptocracies and actually, how democracies get corrupted. And she wrote a pretty provocative piece for Foreign Affairs about that issue. Is America creeping into a kleptocracy? You probably heard me use that word. I said that in 2024, at a minimum, that Donald Trump had turned the Republican Party in some ways into a kleptocracy. I don't think we're there yet as a country, but when you have things like this inaugural fund that law firms have to pay into in order to keep the government off their back, that would pretty much put you into that in that category where you might be arguing that we are creeping into that. So look, it's a long conversation. I want to get into that, but before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the second 100 days, because I think, in fairness to him, look, I've been highly critical because I think this has been a disastrous start. This is not because whether I support him or oppose him. This is just political incompetence, how they've gone about this. Yes, I think it's economic incompetence too. But if this was the plan, they've executed the plan extraordinarily poorly. Right? There was a way to do government reform better and more secure. There was a way to do tariffs better. There was probably a way to reorder his agenda, but he chose not to do it. And there's a fundamental part of his presidency that strikes me as a bit lazy, that he is kind of mailing it in. And one way you can see this, that Donald Trump is now mailing in the presidency, it's his travel schedule for the first 100 days. He marked the 100th day with a trip to Michigan. What's shocking about his trip to Michigan is that that's the first, essentially, it's the first battleground state he's bothered to visit since the beginning of his term. He had one day where he traveled to North Carolina, Nevada, and California. He was checking out flood damage in North Carolina. This was right there. It was something he had been scoring points on due to the what was a poor recovery effort led by FEMA in Western North Carolina during the remnants of a hurricane that devastated them with floods in Western North Carolina. So he made a political stop there, made a political stop in Nevada, and then and then toured the wildfire damage in LA. But you take that day away, and that's three less. Basically, the only trips he would have made are to the Super Bowl, to the Daytona 500, and to Bedminster or Mar-a-Lago over and over and over again. And what's interesting is that it's quite the contrast from his first term. In his first term, in the first 100 days, he traveled quite a bit. In fact, he was a very, yes, he still golfed quite a bit. Now he seems to be only golfing on weekends. He spent at 1.6 days in a row at Mar-a-Lago, according to my friends over at NBC News, where some federal workers were wondering if he was qualifying for work for home benefits there. He was there so long. But there is a sense that he is just either not interested in traveling the country, not wanting to hold his rallies, which he used to love to do in his first term. And I think I actually think this is another bad political mistake, right? And this is what happens when you surround yourself with people that just tell you what you want to hear. He doesn't want to travel. He doesn't want to work very hard, so he gets to go back to Mar-a-Lago so he can go golf, or he gets to go back to Bedminster so he could go golf. He was in the first term surrounded by people that said, especially if you want to win re-election, you need to be communicating with the public what you're trying to do. The tariff policies are extraordinarily unpopular. His inability to even communicate what they're supposed to do has made it even worse for him. So the fact that he waited literally to his 100th day to have his first public event outside of Washington to explain his tariff policy, I think that just strikes me as lazy. And it is kind of the hallmark of how this White House has been run. In some ways they've make it look like there's a lot of motion going on, but in some ways they're not. He signs executive orders, but he doesn't try to pass legislation. They're trying to take a lot of political shortcuts. They're not doing. If you wanted to cut government, you wouldn't do it the way they're doing it with Doge, because most of the cuts that they make are going to get restored. Most of the executive order he's signing are going to get thrown out by the courts. If he wanted to make real change, he has a Republican Congress that's pretty compliant. But guess what? Legislation is hard. Trying to get lawmakers to do, it's going to take time and effort. And I think, we sit here and wonder, oh, he's an authoritarian. In some ways, he's an authoritarian by laziness, meaning he'd prefer to just sign edicts because he doesn't want to have to put in the work that it takes to host members of Congress and cajole them to do X, or host members of Congress and cajole them to do Y, or travel the country and put public political pressure. He doesn't know, for a guy who prides himself at being Mr. Salesman and Mr. Art of the Deal, he's done a terrible job of selling his policies and selling them to the country. He has spent a lot more time on Truth Social than he has talking with people outside of his bubble. It is notable to me that this week he's at least doing interviews with media entities that are not just espousing the MAGA line of thinking. He interviewed with ABC News, interview with The Atlantic. And that is a huge difference from Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0 talked to everybody. Trump 1.0 was tweeting. Trump 1.0 was trying to communicate with the entire country. I mean, even if, let's just take the example. Let's say he was just so lazy he only wanted to golf on weekends. Well, then travel the country to different golf courses and golf on weekends. Actually connect with the rest of the American people. Right now, he's conducting a presidency that is essentially sitting on Air Force One or one of his two clubs. He's a creature of habit. He's creature comfort. And when you get older, that's what happens. Joe Biden spent just about every weekend in Delaware. Well, Donald Trump wants to spend every weekend at Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster. And so it just struck me that to see this event, which was surprising, right? He gets a lot of energy from these things. So the question is, perhaps maybe he's just getting older, getting more tired, doesn't want to, needs to work 3.5, 4 days a week, doesn't want to have the full 5-day weeks, wants to have extra recovery time. Whatever it is, I actually think it's harming his presidency just from a communication standpoint. Whether you love him or hate him, he's the best communicator they have. And he doesn't seem to actually want to go out there and communicate with the public right now. He went to Michigan. It's almost like they said, okay, we got to have a 100 days event, but he's right back here. So anyway, it's just fascinating to me how I think that as tumultuous as the first 100 days, there's an underlying aspect of this, that there's actually kind of a laziness to the president in his lack of salesmanship, lack of doing these things. One other thing, because I think it's a fair question. So what would I've been pretty doom and gloom. I think it's going to be pretty hard for Donald Trump to recover. I think he's probably, if you told me, if I went into a coma today and didn't wake up until January 20th, 2029, and you said to me, Donald Trump's approval rating never got over 45% for the rest of the term while you were in a coma, it wouldn't surprise me. And I've gone through the reasonings before of why I did this. I think particularly in a second term, that's part of the, why there's probably a shorter leash with the public like sort of, oh, he's going to be that. All right, forget it. Right. And they may give up on him quicker, especially since he's messing up on supposedly the issue that was his core competency. But let me do the other side. So let's say I wake up and from my mythical coma, and it turns out he's popular. What would have happened? Well, I think in this next 100 days, he must, for that to happen, for him to sort of right this ship, he needs some points on the board. Maybe he cuts an Iran deal. Maybe he gets both Russia and Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire. Maybe he's able to get Israel and the Palestinians to at least cease violent interactions. Perhaps he's able to get some trade deals with India, Australia, Japan, the UK. I'm skeptical of all those things, but it's not out of the question, right? It's not as if those aren't active things he's engaged in at the moment. But that's what the next, oh no, by the way, how about putting some shovels in the ground for some new factories, right? There's a lot of pledges out there. He doesn't even have a Foxconn that he's been able to, which was that company that announced this big, I remember Trump and Paul Ryan together, they announced this big investment into Wisconsin, this company called Foxconn, and the investment never really happened. But he needs some shovels in the ground somewhere, some ribbon cuttings to do that. So, what would, if day 101 to 200, if on day 201 his numbers are 10 points better than they are today, these are the things that need to happen. Peace deal in Ukraine, peace deal in the Middle East. Maybe he gets Saudi Arabia to formally go public in their recognition of Israel. Individual trade deals with Japan and India and Australia. Perhaps maybe some pullback on the tariffs in China and positive market reaction. Now, again, all of those things are certainly things he's trying to do, and I think all of them are quite tough, because here's the other problem that he has, and I think I mentioned this during the last one. I think he's given up a lot of his leverage, because guess what? Everybody knows he needs a deal, and now the UK is teaming up with the EU. So I guess not only has Donald Trump impacted the politics of Canada, but did he just un-Brexit? I guess we call it Brentrance at this point, with the UK and the EU essentially doing their own trade deal to start working together to deal with America. Perhaps that he can call that an international victory. He's helping reunite Europe economically. But these are the things that I think he needs to get to happen, and I think he's going to have a hard time doing it. And he's going to have an even harder time doing it if he is going to go about this presidency sort of working 3.5, 4 days a week and not traveling the country and not communicating with all of America. Right now, he just rants to his supporters, makes him happy on Truth Social. What he doesn't fully appreciate is no one sees this stuff outside of his filter bubble. Guess what? That 40% of the country is with him. There's another 60% that's not with him. And he doesn't seem to be that interested in communicating with that 60% anymore. Trump 1.0 was. Trump 1.0 traveled the country. Trump 1.0 seemed to want to connect to the public. Perhaps this is the best evidence we have yet that Trump has no interest in a third term, because if he did, he'd be behaving like somebody who wanted to run for re-election. He's behaving like somebody who's worn out already at the start of a second term. And look, he's not a spring chicken, and it could very well be that the job itself has become physically taxing. All right, so with that, I want to pause here. We're going to sneak in a quick break, and when we come back, it's a fascinating conversation with Jodi Vittori. And again, we talk about a lot of countries and sort of the various phases. When is something a kleptocracy? When isn't it? And, can you have sort of pieces of a democracy become a kleptocracy, but the democracy itself is still healthy enough to push back on authoritarianism? What I like about Dr. Vittori is that she is not an academic first. She is a practitioner that is now in academia teaching her real life experiences. So with that, enjoy the interview. So what is the state of the American democracy? This is a question I get frequently from friends, neighbors, viewers, listeners. Are we in a constitutional crisis? How things are? And my answer for the last 6 months is like, well, the thing that I'm nervous about is that, stage one of an authoritarian regime is when a democracy becomes a kleptocracy. And I had been kind of saying it without a lot of academic rigor. And then I read a terrific piece in foreign policy by Georgetown professor, Dr. Jodi Vittori, who is my guest today, who wrote about this very issue, that making the case that we are now in an early stages of what, if this were happening in any other country, would identify as, hey, this appears to be forming a kleptocracy. So, Dr. Vittori, appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me here today. I appreciate it.
So, look, let's start with what we mean. You hear the word kleptocracy, and I'll be honest, it's like, is this some sort of Superman word, or does it have to do with the Kremlin, right? Like, there's a lot of people, kleptocracy, Define it and give me a couple of examples around the world that you might file under kleptocracy right now.
Sure. So kleptocracy literally means rule by thieves, like kleptomaniac, someone who can't stop, stealing. Ocracy at the end, like democracy, government by the people, theocracy, government by religion. So kleptocracy is just putting those two together. So government by thieves. And there's no
Government by thieves. Let's
by
take a
thieves.
step back. That's there you go.
It's
Some
not
people
a
call
charming
thieves
term.
pirates. No, it's not charming at all. There's no upside.
No.
There's never a positive case for a kleptocracy, is there?
No, there is not. Although people will try to come up with some crazy reasons to justify why they should be a kleptocracy, or what they're really doing is reforming things, or that's how their culture is set up, or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're very predatory on their citizens and often very predatory on the world. So there's not one definition of what kinds of things make rule by thieves, or what's thiefy enough, what's thievery enough to make it a kleptocracy. But there's a couple things that we look at that when we're thinking about a place that is a kleptocracy. One is that just the amount of money and stuff that is being basically stolen by these thieves, and what happens to the institutions of government. And so we have different terms that have, like, if you like Venn diagrams, there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Kleptocracy, grand corruption, and state capture often get used interchangeably. There's some slight differences between them.
Yeah, nationalizing an economy, is that automatically a kleptocracy?
It doesn't have to be. And I will push back on one of your first sentences just a little bit. There
Yeah.
are rare cases where you have incredibly authoritarian regimes, even totalitarian regimes, that don't engage in large scale grand corruption.
Okay.
So they're still hideous. Think Pol Pot in Cambodia. Lots of petty corruption, people paying bribes to just survive. But Pol Pot was not buying mansions in the south of France or anything during this, or
Okay.
Nyeri in Tanzania. The entire population was impoverished under his regime, but he wasn't buying fancy mansions somewhere in the States or something like that. So they are rare, but you can have authoritarian and even totalitarian regimes that are not kleptocracies.
Okay.
But most kleptocracies will be at least competitive authoritarianism, have significant backsliding if they've been democracies ever, because you can't have rule by thieves in a functioning governing democracy and have people not protesting and voting the bums out and so forth. So you need to make sure you stay in power to run your kleptocracy. So they'll at least be very shaky on the democracy side, all the way up to full-fledged totalitarian dictatorships like Kim Jong-un or North Korea or something like that.
So we would look at so what you're describing to me, the immediate country that jumps out is Putin and Russia.
Yes.
Because here's a guy who does have big mansions. Here's a people with a bunch of oligarchs who've made money off the state. It seems that this is how he kind of controls the wealthy diaspora, is through some sort of investments. I mean, is that the clearest example we have probably around the world right now in a semi-large country?
Well, autocracies can come in a lot of different forms. So you asked me a couple different types, and they work different ways. The one we most think of is probably Russia, and it's think of their oligarchs. They're not quite oligarchs nowadays, but the types of oligarchs, this very, very tiny inner grouping that controls the Russian economy, can decide to send it to war in devastating ways and devastate their next door neighbor in Ukraine. The lack of democracy in there, they have kind of fake votes, but it's not, obviously it's not a functioning real democracy. But just the huge amount of money, what we call asset stripping and so forth, that occurs there. That's one kind. You have other kleptocracies, like in Afghanistan under the Taliban Part 1 and the United States, where it's just a free-for-all. In Russia's case, you know exactly who's in charge.
We had the warlords, right? Each warlord had their own they kind of wanted to control their economic weather in Afghanistan.
So Sudan right now would be a great example of that, just total chaos sort of kleptocracy. And then you have sort of the more refined sort of kleptocracies. Think of Hungary or the UAE. That can be nice places to go visit. They seem to have some level of rule of law when you're there. You're not getting, this is not Afghanistan or Sudan, clearly.
Right.
They're kind of shiny in the nice downtown areas and so forth. And they're a much more subtle sort of form of kleptocracy. Hungary is the classic example. Orban calls his country an illiberal democracy. That's his goal. Of course, is an oxymoron. Liberal with a small L, obviously, not a big L. It's an oxymoron. You can't be democratic and not be liberal with the rule of law and rule of law institutions and so forth. But he has made it so that his cronies control the media. He makes sure his friends get contracts. These are very expensive contracts and so forth. The United States, if it does slip into kleptocracy, will be unique because we have never had a situation where a consolidated democracy with strong governing institutions has gone to a full-fledged kleptocracy before. It was always theoretically possible, but it hasn't happened. There have been grand corruption scandals in places.
Right.
But,
I mean, look, I look at Teapot Dome was probably the closest we came to looking like a kleptocracy, that the Taft essentially filled his cabinet with a bunch of guys that were just trying to make money off the taxpayers.
Sure. But the United States wouldn't be considered a consolidated democracy at that point. We don't really truly become a fully fledged consolidated democracy until after the passing of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. So again, that's not going to qualify. Plus, the U.S. is the country in the international system. It's the reserve currency. It's the largest military.
We set the rules, essentially.
We set the rules. What happens when the state power in the global system, if it becomes a kleptocracy? We don't have a historic model for that.
So I started using the word sort of in this, and I was trying to, I have the episodes to prove it. I was trying to explain why Donald Trump was so obsessed with tariffs. And yes, he cared about these trade deficits and I think misunderstood them, but I'm going to set that aside. The real benefit that he enjoyed in the first term with tariffs that he learned about, and this is how I always say Trump is very much is a rote learner, and you can't fool him twice. And so what the tariffs allow him to do is encourage people to have to come to him for exemptions, and that the exemption process is how we can end up in a kleptocracy where he has full control of different aspects of the economy, because he can decide winners and losers. He can decide you get a tariff, you don't get a tariff. You get this, you don't get this. And that this is what was so dangerous about his tariff policy, because it wasn't about the tariffs themselves. It was about that he was going to have singular control of the economy. But what you just described, I'm actually questioning whether that's that maybe we have enough checks and balances that he can create an administration that's a kleptocracy, but he can't really change the system into that per se. Am I being naive?
I think a little bit. I mean, our founding fathers did an amazing job on taking government and setting up in ways with checks and balances.
It's more remarkable all the time with the stuff they thought of. When I think about the emoluments clause, I think about, the only thing I can't figure out is why the heck they thought presidents should have pardon power. Like, what was the point of getting away from the king? But anyway, I could set that one little thing aside. The idea that presidents couldn't be put on trial very easily, and that you might actually have to do it in a different way. It is remarkable to me how they understood what the public would be able to take and what they couldn't.
And they were, in many ways, some scholars make the argument that a lot of what went into the Constitution is actually anti-corruption methods and institutions as they understood them at the time. Things like the emoluments clause. They had seen kings bribed with, chests of gold. They didn't, that's why they put it in there. It was in the Articles of Confederation. There's not even really debate in putting it in the Constitution. It's just like, well, duh.
It was a given. Yeah, of course we're doing that. Right.
Well, you have to live in your district. So you can't just, have these rotten boroughs where, somebody's patron or whatever, just, you declare them your MP in Parliament. So a lot of the Constitution is actually corruption as they know it. But it, of course, assumes famously, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. In many ways, it's set up to use one person's greed against the other. It's one of the things I've always loved most about our founding fathers. As someone who reads a lot of political theory, Marxism and a lot of the Islamism under Said Qutb and others assume that you can make a perfect society. And our founding fathers took people as they were. And so, it's this idea that Congress should be a check on the president, actually supposed to be the most important power, which you've brought up before in other episodes. And the role of the Supreme Court evolves over time. But right now there's big concerns because, of course, Congress isn't acting as a check. Indeed, Trump is not, unlike in his first term,
It's
Trump is not
captive
putting
right now.
anything.
The leadership of Congress has been captured right now.
I mean, they approved
Politically.
Pete Hegseth.
Right.
I mean, come
They
on.
approved Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yeah. I mean, who in a million years would have thought that these people are qualified to be in government? We have a Supreme Court that basically gave a tremendous amount of impunity to Trump himself, in the United States versus Trump, which is extremely concerning, and a Supreme Court that, especially since 2010, has really shrunk what the definition of corruption even is.
They seem to be really afraid of the voters. For a group of people that don't have to face the voters, the Supreme Court, like I think Robert's motives are pure is the wrong word to use here, are noble, even if he's producing outcomes that I understand what he's trying to avoid. And I think what we all know is that these are lessons you can't put off these lessons. And the longer you put it off, the worse it's going to get. But I understand what he thinks he's trying to avoid. How's that? But they look way too captured. They look way too afraid of the people on this one, and of a small group of people.
Well, and the concerns about, $500,000 Winnebagos and so forth aren't exactly helping their credibility with the people. And the fact
not at all. Yeah.
That's a big part of what you deal with in any sort of society, but particularly if society really is becoming much more kleptocratic, is the sort of every day it's another, how is this okay? That degradation of society, its values, its norms, as its institutions are allowed to degrade themselves. So the society at large in many ways degrades itself.
So, it's one of those, this feels like one of those things, like trying to figure out when a recession begins. Well, we sort of know after we leave it, right? Like it's always easier to find out when a recession started after we're done with the recession than when we're in the middle of it. Is that how you would describe trying to, how do you know when we're in a kleptocracy? Perhaps we're already in it. We don't feel it, right? We're the boiled frog, and we just don't fully realize it yet. Or are there more signs we should be looking for?
Different scholars some will argue that we're already at least in an oligarchy, and this came up quite a bit since 2008. And you actually brought up in one of your other shows the fact that nobody went to jail for gross malfeasance that led to 2008. That at least if not a kleptocracy, these increasing concerns about the United States already being an oligarchy. Ruled by the few, where those few, it's an Aristotelian term, literally from 350 BC. That these are individuals that are in charge for their benefit, not for the benefit of society overall.
And you know what they would argue at the time, because this was the argument at the time, right? The economy's too big to fail. And even though we have these horrible bad actors, we don't have time to decide who was nefarious and who was accidental. We have to bail out the economy so that it doesn't destroy the rest of the global order, right? Like it felt as if it was like people exempted these people from punishment because you don't understand we're in the middle of we don't have time to arrest people in the middle of a hurricane.
Mm-hmm. And I understand the argument, and at the time it actually makes a lot of sense, and many of those who were in charge had been students of the Great Depression. But after the fact, they still didn't go to jail. Right. And it wasn't just that. We've seen the role that money is playing increasingly in politics, how different, we focus a lot on the Supreme Court and Citizens United, but a lot of campaign finance laws and rules have actually been degraded under the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court over the years, to a shell of what they were in the past. The amount of what constituted corruption has shrunk. The ability of politicians to accept money. One of the interesting things about the definition of a conflict of interest overall is we know it degrades a democracy, but conflict of interest doesn't actually have to be illegal, unlike bribery or something where there's illegality. The concept is if a rational person could have questions about that civil servant or that politician and where their interest lies, that's where the conflict of interest is.
Right. Doesn't make it a crime, doesn't make it illegal, but it makes it unethical.
It makes it highly unethical, but it also just degrades your overall democracy and your overall governing system. And that's the kind of things that we see with, the Supreme Court and the expensive fishing trips and the expensive Winnebagos. Clearly, I need better friends. Because I'm not getting free Winnebagos, the ability for large amounts of money to be bundled and so forth and given to politicians, the weakening of the rules of what they can use for personal use versus non-personal use, and the role of private loans, even book sales, stuff like that. So irrational.
It used to be worse though, Jodi. I have to tell you, like, I always love to tell this story to my students when I'm teaching about, like, as bad as it seems now, it used to be worse. So did you know that in 1992, so in 1992, that was my first year covering campaign politics. And that year we had this astronomical amount of members of Congress decided to not seek reelection. And there was a variety of reasons for that. Number one, you had a check bouncing scandal where they got to write checks without any money to cover it, and the government just covered it. That was a weird, and even when you go back to this day, you're like, I can't believe members of Congress just had this sort of a checkbook without money in it, and it always cashed. You're less like, that's crazy. There was also a reapportionment year, and so people don't like to run in new lines. But there was one other thing. They had just changed the law. Prior to 1992, a member of Congress could retire and keep their campaign money as their own, personal, just like an IRA. Like, here you go. I mean, after 1992, in theory, members of Congress are not allowed to personally pocket campaign money once they're done running for office. But prior to 1992, members of Congress could do that. Like, so I take your point here, but we've actually had looser laws in the past that allowed for some shocking things like what I just described.
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And the laws are always changing. And when you make a law, someone finds a loophole. Right after.
Yeah, that's why I always say money finds. Like, it's really hard to legislate campaign finance because money finds a way, right? Life finds a way. Money finds a way. Like, 501c4s, 501c3s. We came up with all of these weird tax code things that people have found where you're like, oh no, as long as it's not advocacy, you can use it. Registering people to vote is not advocacy, so you can use this dark money to do that, right? Like, we keep changing, but there's definitely been, I think it's really hard to legislate money out of politics.
It will be, but when we look at the United States compared to other countries, like the ability to give unlimited amounts of dark money under many circumstances is unique. That's
fair point.
The German Marshall Fund did a really interesting study and looked at a lot of countries and their campaign finance laws, and everybody's got a loophole somewhere that everybody thinks is crazy. But this whole Citizens United and dark money capability, that one really stands out in the world that you don't have that you really don't see in other places. When you get a big corruption scandal with campaign finance in Britain or something, you're talking about a few $1 million, not tens and tens of millions of dollars.
No, a few $1 million these days is just a state legislative race.
And we just kind of look at the like, oh, isn't that cute?
Yeah.
When they're complaining about their corruption scandals, we're like, oh, let's talk here.
So what's a next step for us on this dark road to kleptocracy?
So the kinds of things, the rules that keep coming out are more and more concerning. We talked about campaign finance and the issues with that. But given my teaching and my career, I started working on these issues actually when I was back in the military on an anti-corruption task force. What really stands out for me is the fact that as the Trump administration has come in this time, they have undermined so many of the anti-corruption rules and the Department of Justice institutions that are meant to minimize the levels of corruption coming in. So we already had lots of issues and lots of loopholes and questions about enforcement, like with 2008 and nobody going to jail. But things like, we're just not, the fact that this ties with your constitutional crisis concerns, the fact that the government said, we're just not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
And we're not going to enforce the law, ironically, which passed in Trump 1, that ends in most anonymous shell companies. Not only are we not going to enforce it, we're going to make an interim final rule that is the exact opposite of what Congress legislated. And Congress, good luck with that, and the courts, good luck with that.
Right.
These are very frightening issues. And then you add crypto to it. Not only the Trump family and their business interests with crypto, but just putting crypto-friendly individuals in there. Lots of people have different opinions on what is the value of crypto, or does it have a value outside of money laundering and corruption? Right. People haven't.
I'm pretty cynical about it. It feels like the entire crypto industry decided to get on board Trump in the last 6 months of the campaign because they saw that as the fastest way to make their Bitcoin investments worth more than they actually are?
So our prior Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, had noted, and lots of people noted it before, that the United States was already the easiest place in the world to launder your money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with not enforcing the
Hey,
foreign
I
corrupt,
watched Ozark.
you've
We
seen it,
saw that, right?
Marco,
Like,
right?
right. Ozark really taught everybody how to do it. Oh, okay. We
Yeah.
treat that in the Americans. I look at every travel agency now with skepticism, thanks to the Americans.
Mhm.
And you're just sitting there going, yeah, casinos. Makes sense
Yep.
to me.
Let's throw some crypto in there. What could go wrong? And let's
What
let
could
banks
go
deal
wrong?
in it more and more. And yeah, let's let normal people get involved. What could go wrong?
Mm-hmm.
So you've already got as a place where we have lots of dirty money flowing around. We don't actually know how much because we have more secrecy rules than about 90 different countries in the world. The standard is not anonymous shell companies, for example. The United States on January 1, 2021, passed
Mm-hmm.
the Corporate Transparency Act as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. They did have to override Trump's veto for it, not because of the corrupt
Right.
Corporate Transparency Act. That ended this ability to do anonymous shell companies. So if you have anonymous shell companies, we have anonymous trust, we have all sorts of anonymity that we treat as basically the getaway car for all sorts of illicit money coming by
Right.
with the United States. But if you think of a society with so much dirty money coming in into its politics, into its economic sectors, we've
Right.
often focused on federal government, but state and local governments are particularly susceptible to corruption.
Yep.
And what that does to your larger country, what it does to your democracy. So we were already the easiest place to launder money, and we basically put out a giant welcome sign that says,
Yeah.
"Bring it here, bring it on." And here's, if you have $5 million, you can buy some citizenship too.
Well, that's right. And we're not asking, I guess there's no character test with that. It's whether your check clears. Um,
Yes,
are
and
there, it's interesting you brought up state legislatures. I mean, it is, I always say the least corrupt legislature in America is Congress because we have more eyeballs on it. The fewer eyeballs you have on the state level and the local level, that's where you're usually, city councils to me are the most corruptible. I'm not saying they're all corruptible because, developers, we all know, that story's as old as time. But since you brought up states, are there certain states that are worse than others that stand out to you?
so states don't get evaluated the same way as
Mm-hmm.
countries do. This is one of
Mm-hmm.
the issues for the United States. We're such a big country, and we kind of have 50 plus. We had DC and Puerto Rico and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Different polities, different local governments, different civil societies. So, when we think of what place is the most corrupt in the world or whatever, there's the corruption barometer that Transparency International does. There's the Corruption Perceptions Index. There's the World Bank Governance Index. There's all these indexes, but none of
Right.
those are the states. There's only been
Mm-hmm.
a couple attempts to even look at how corrupt states are, and there's a lot of issues in even trying to measure. A
Yeah.
couple of different ones. One of them looked at what were some of the worst states when it came to their actual laws.
Yeah.
Um, for those who live in Virginia, it actually comes out as one of the worst ones because they have some of the worst laws in the
Well,
United
their
States.
campaign finance laws are
Abysmal.
garbage. I mean,
Yeah, they're
just
completely
anybody can
abysmal.
write a check. Yeah.
Yeah, you can have business in front of
Mm-hmm.
the state legislature and write a check and no problem,
Right.
which
It's
is
not
highly problematic. Speaking
there's
of
no
conflict,
investigation, nothing. Right.
no, and there's huge loopholes in it.
South
Um,
Dakota, I know, has a crazy trust law that allows people to hide money. Uh, I know they changed their law on purpose in order to
yeah,
attract, people to do this, if I'm not
Florida
mistaken.
recently did that as well. Florida made it easier to hide money. It was interesting too because they were, as far as we could tell, it was actually changed for the Walmart family, or at least that was the main lobbyist behind it. But it was,
Interesting.
as far as local media reports, hey, if Wyoming can do that, why can't we?
Right.
To make it easier to do anonymous trust, which are,
Made it a competition thing. Don't you want this big money in this state? It's be good for the state, is
but it's not good
so
for the
goes the
state.
argument.
In Wyoming,
Right.
it's been good for a tiny number of, five or
Mm.
six key individuals. Actually, it's not helped the typical population at all, and it's become one of the scam capitals of the world. And
Mm.
strangely enough, like North Korean government was using the ability to form these anonymous companies and trusts and so forth in Wyoming, particularly to undermine U.S. national security, to be able to get into companies and so forth, to make these fake
Mhm.
LinkedIn profiles and so forth, and get their people embedded in
Right.
companies, secrets and so forth, and money. So it's undermining U.S. national security with no real benefit to the state of Wyoming itself. And so other ways we measure states is just an attempt to look at, do their laws actually meet the needs of their citizens and stuff. Not surprisingly, southern states do particularly poorly by that. A recent book that literally just came out in the last month by Michael Johnston and Ozgan Dinser tries to do different assessments of states and try to figure out, looking at things like police violence and its links to racial politics and the environment and so forth in those states.
So one of the ways that I try to make myself feel better about this current era is how similar to me it looks to the early 20th century. And, you know, I look at the early 20th century and we can sit here and we can talk about the robber barons, and there was a lot of those issues, but it also was a massive period of reform, political reform, economic reform. Clearly the public wasn't happy, and you saw movements. We had direct election of senators. We got women the right to vote. We've got the trust busters, and, you know, this idea that, you know, maybe the government ought to be involved in regulating business. Let's assume we are going to enter a period of reform. And I think that the fact of the matter is, the most likely scenario, if we don't like how things turn out in this administration as a public, we're probably going to correct in that direction. Like, we're going to be looking for, you know, ways to make sure we don't have this happen again, right? Whatever we decide that is. So what is some reform legislation that, you know, assuming we do head in that direction, what makes sense? What would you like to see? Or is this stuff that's already on the books and we just need better enforcement of the laws on the books and a Justice Department focused on it?
So a couple things are going to have to happen. And a lot of these have been put out by Lewitsky, Way, Zyblatt. I mean, there's lots of these out. So none of these are going to be a surprise. A lot of it is just making politics so that people have a greater input into the politics themselves. And so that's going to include anti-gerrymandering, so that people choose their politicians more than politicians choosing their voters.
Yeah, I want to double the size of Congress. I think that would be a huge way of trying to get Congress closer to the people, and you would minimize gerrymandering. But anyway, go ahead.
And the size of Congress, but you're still going to have to make anti-gerrymandering rules.
You would. Yeah.
Both parties have played with gerrymandering. The Republicans took it to a new level, but both sides have played with it. So gerrymandering, you're going to have to do some sort of anti-Citizens United reform. You're going to have to do an amendment to overturn.
You think there needs to be a constitutional amendment, right?
Yeah. So there are probably some constitutional amendments or some creative ways to get around them. Popular elections would help a great deal, so that you no longer have that imbalance between rural and less populated areas versus.
Well, if you double the size, I will make this. I'm making this argument. If you double the size of the House, and there's no constitutional amendment needed, then all of a sudden the Electoral College isn't a problem anymore, by the way, because you change the math. Yeah, you do change the math. You know, and the reason I'm like obsessed with that is anything that avoids a constitutional amendment, I'm always looking for, because we know how difficult it is. Yeah.
But they're not impossible. I mean, think of the 16th Amendment was the income tax amendment, and that was all about corruption and the fact that you had robber barons and they weren't paying their taxes. Wow, that sounds really familiar lately. So obviously, they immediately found loopholes, et cetera. But this was supposed to be one of the means that you limited corruption, you limited oligarchy in whatever year past 1920, whatever. This was one of the major reforms, and it was an amendment that passed incredibly rapidly. Yeah. So it is hard. It's not impossible. But with some of the Supreme Court decisions that have come down, Trump versus the United States is probably the most frightening one. And then, you know, movements to reform the Supreme Court itself, you know, who gets to pick the judges, maybe having a term limits on the court, or, you know, people so many years and then go back to their old courts, for example. So you have a constant rotation, or giving every president to, you know, two justices that come in, so that you're not always having this major fight. So these are some of the standard things that really stand out. And a lot of the campaign finance reform sort of things that were there in the past, sort of getting back really to the original founders. Limiting lobbying. Lobbying was not an enforceable contract in the United States in the 1870s per the Supreme Court. It wasn't criminal. But if you got double crossed by, you know, if you paid a lobbyist and then the lobbyist felt like they didn't get paid enough, they couldn't take you to court because it wasn't considered a enforceable contract because you were monetizing your citizenship.
So when did that change?
It starts to change it. It's affirmed by the Supreme Court up to the 1870s. And then starting in the 1930s is really where this starts sort of like bit by bit sort of getting taken apart. And then it really hits gangbusters after 2010.
It's amazing. My friend Brody Mellons and his brother wrote a terrific book on lobbying that's out right now called The Wolves of K Street. Mm-hmm. And the basic point is sort of like the world of lobbying has gotten so perverted now. It used to be, it was corporate interest versus the public interest, right? There'd be some advocacy group making one case and corporations would make their own case. And ultimately the politician had to choose between the citizens group or the corporate group. Now you have two companies in the same sector who are essentially trying to put the other company out of business. And they each use lobbyists, and it's sort of like, we're not involved as citizens. It's just two companies arguing who can weaponize government regulation in their favor. And like, we've really perverted lobbying really down to that. And it is the concept of lobbying makes a lot of sense to me. As, by the way, the Federalist Papers point out, they expected some form of this, citizens groups, things like that, the various factions. But how it works right now in Washington, I don't know where citizens go to lobby, put it that way.
And that's where we really start getting back to our original discussion of the concerns about kleptocracy. Mm-hmm. Where in a kleptocracy, the institutions of the state are morphed in a way that the national interest, the interests of the citizens at best are secondary. They're definitely not the primary. And that goes for domestic politics, foreign politics. They're definitely not secondary, maybe tertiary. In some states, like Democratic Republic of Congo or something, they don't even show up. They're not, they're not even there. And so your discussion about different lobbyists for different industries arguing with each other, where does a citizen go to have their interests brought forward? There are some controversial studies that say citizens actually have very little influence on government. Those are controversial. There's a lot of legitimate arguments that the methodology was flawed in those particular studies. But certainly we've seen the realm where money seems to at least buy more influence. When I worked for civil society, we would often go work with the staffers for various members of Congress. They were wonderful staffers. They were great to work with. But I live in outside of Washington, D.C. My lobbyist friends would meet with the senator, not the staffers. Just that access between the advocacy groups. And these included religious groups and so forth.
No, everybody rationalizes it now. I mean, I love how, all these groups that Trump's trying to target, they're hiring Trump's favorite lobbyist, Brian Ballard.
Basically a pass-through to his
right. It's sort of, and again, to me, that's how you're in a kleptocracy, when somebody who wants to play by the rules decides, well, that's what the rules are, so I got to play by those rules. I'm not going to play by the rules. I'm playing by his rules.
But one of the things you also see in a kleptocracy is where the institutions make it easier to engage in kleptocracy, and you start getting on a vicious cycle. So when you say things like, you're not enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you're not enforcing anti-anonymous shell company things, you're going to gut the IRS's ability to go after major taxpayers. Doesn't mean you're in one, but it's a very concerning set of red flags that you're making it easier to engage in significant corruption.
I mean, I'm going to be a bit cynical here, but we've essentially put out a welcome mat for anybody that wants to hide money in the world. Yes. Have we not? Yeah,
absolutely. And
forget Switzerland anymore. Forget the Caymans. Aren't we as good as anybody?
As I mentioned before, former Secretary of the Treasury Yellen said we're the easiest place to launder money, and the Tax Justice Network and plenty of other groups would have agreed with her. And it's gotten much.
And this is over and above the Caymans, right? Who was notorious back in the day, right?
The Tax Justice Network tries to assess these, and the top ones are always the Cayman Islands, usually Switzerland, British Virgin Islands, and us somewhere in the top ones. I haven't looked at this year's, but we're always in like the top three, which is not a top three you want to be in.
No.
But that was those are even before we get into the changes since January 20th, with further enabling crypto, saying you're not going to enforce anti-corruption laws, gutting various asset forfeiture and other task forces that have now been dissolved by the Attorney General. The golden passport thing is not really helping the situation in that regard, because you're saying, hey, pay me off and you can have US citizenship and all the rights and protections internationally that go with it. But even before that, there were concerns. The reasons the United States was already at the top. It was the easiest place to form anonymous shell companies, anonymous trusts, et cetera. It was the loopholes for being able to evade taxes and stuff are already incredibly high. Those shell companies and through other means, but also things like tax sharing, information sharing. So when you filed your taxes, assuming you did it since we just passed tax day, you had to file whether you had any overseas bank accounts.
Right.
United States with Switzerland in particular, something called Swiss Leaks in 2016, where I found out all these Americans are hiding their money in Switzerland. They require countries, they put a lot of pressure on companies to send the information on bank accounts of American citizens to the US. But the United States doesn't share that information with other countries in return. So what that did is become, well, open all your bank accounts in the States and get an anonymous shell company, get an anonymous trust. You can't just directly open an anonymous shell company into a US bank. It's not quite that easy because banks have rules under the bank secrecy law and so forth. But you can use that as an ability to put money in hedge funds or other areas to launder your money. And so if you're a Swiss citizen, that information isn't going to be shared back to Switzerland. If you're an American citizen with a bank account in Switzerland, that information is going to come to the US government. If you're a Swiss citizen hiding your money in the United States, that's not going to go to the Swiss government. So that started that made the United States an even better place to launder their money.
So to close the loop then, is it the Trump administration that has brought upon a kleptocracy, or are we already had all of the elements of it and whoever's president could essentially lean in or lean out depending on what they choose?
I would put it, if the United States is going into a kleptocracy, and obviously the warning signs are there. The old sun also rises quote from Hemingway that everybody uses, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly and then quickly, or something like that.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing with kleptocracy. And that is, how did the United States become a kleptocracy? Well, there's this chiseling away of laws, campaign finance, United.
Citizens United, blah, 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 30 years of this.
The ability to avoid your taxes, the fact the IRS was already underfunded and unable to go after tax avoidance, and money laundering, even though they're not technically the same, use the exact same processes. So whether you're hiding your fentanyl, you're hiding money from your wife you're about to divorce so you don't pay alimony, they're the same processes and often the same organizations in the same places. So that sort of stuff was already there, but then whatever duct tape was kind of holding the system together, and things were actually starting to improve a little bit in the United States with these new laws, with the new regulations that were going in. Like that's just that's rapidly being hard as we speak.
Let me get you out of here on this. How did you become an expert in this? What brought you to, when you're in college, you're like, I'm going to be a specialist on understanding, what happens when a government becomes corrupt and how corrupt governments happen. But I'm guessing that isn't how you got into this. How'd you end up? Give me your little bit of your origin story here before we go.
Anti-corruption specialist was definitely not on my bingo card. Actually, I didn't go to university. I went to military academy.
Okay.
And I studied engineering. And
excellent.
Discovered
Which one? Which academy?
Air Force Academy.
Okay.
And so I was, I went into the intelligence career field. I ended up working on issues with terrorism finance, the taxpayers.
So you saw how money was moved very corruptly.
I got very interested when I was on peacekeeping in the Balkans, worked on some terrorism finance related issues, ended up getting pulled into NATO's only anti-corruption task force ever, which was in Afghanistan, which, you really start to at the time, Afghanistan was the second most corrupt country in the world, according to the Transparency International. When I left, it was the most corrupt. So there we go. Those who can't do teach.
Yeah.
But it kept working on it. And I come from corruption from a different perspective than a lot of others. Most come into it from a law enforcement or a human rights perspective. I come from it from a hard military perspective because
I feel like a national security perspective, really.
Very national security, very hard power. Yeah. What does it do? I served in Iraq, I served in Afghanistan. Both were mission failures in many ways because of corruption.
Corruption, right? Yeah.
When you talk about why did Afghanistan fall to the Taliban, ultimately it's either Pakistan or corruption. Always one of those two.
I was just going to say, and some might argue, Pakistan and corruption go hand in hand.
Absolutely, yeah, and they're definitely overlapping circles there. So I kept working on it and realized that not many people from a military background were writing on it and had that academic background to what is corruption? What is kleptocracy?
Yeah.
How do we define it? Why do we get mission failure out of these things? And just kept working on it.
Well, your students are pretty lucky. That's a good that's a different background. You're not somebody who's just been in the world of hypotheticals, the world of, London School of Economics. No disrespect to them, but sort of a different, more of a real world.
Yeah, no, it's a very combat boot sort
Yeah.
of on the ground in, Kabul and Iraq in the Balkans, sort of.
You saw political theory get implemented rather than just read about
Or not.
it. We're not implemented, but either way.
I had my PhD and I landed on the ground, and I'm like,
Yeah.
some things of the theory worked, and some were like, boy, that was crap.
Yeah.
So it was the school of
I-
hard knocks running with academics.
I'm sure it's like that. That's where the Mike Tyson quote comes in, right? Quote comes in. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It sounds similar. Hey, Dr. Jodi Vittori, I learned a lot. It was a very provocative piece, but I thought a necessary one. And it's like, this isn't just about throwing around names, right? And throwing around, this is late stage democracy when you start to lose it. And I think we need to be a little more aware of it. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
You got it. So I'd love your comments about this interview with Jodi Vittori here. What you think of whether we are at a kleptocracy and what we could do about it. I do think that the issue of money in politics, which is I've kind of been hitting on that theme a little bit with the variety of my guests here. The ease with which money circulates in the political system does make this the opportunity to pay to play, pay to survive, whatever you want to call it. It is more likely to happen, and it is a problem. And we're going to need more politicians willing to essentially not be tempted by the opportunity that is out there for pay to play, and instead try to find some laws that perhaps protect the democracy from that. But voters are going to have to care about it enough to scare these politicians into doing it. All right, let's take a few questions. Let's dig in to the file, what we call around here the Ask Chuck file. Ask Chuck. There it is. You got the music, so that helps get me in the mood. All right. I'm just going to plow forward here with 4 questions, and I'm going to try to keep my answers tight. And we'll go from there. In a society, this one comes from Dave in Alexandria, Virginia. In a society that has granted personhood to corporations, I assume he is kind of referring to Citizens United, has it come time to grant the same protection to the state and its populace in preventing them from reckless and false statements? Is it time to make false, active, and malicious statements by the government or actively filed political candidates illegal? So I think what you have to get at is intent, right? Is somebody making a false statement because they believe in that falsehood, or they're making the false statement because they know it's false, right? And that's, motive when it comes to speech is a very difficult thing to prove. And I'll be honest with you, I read this question about 3 or 4 different times, and I was thinking about not bothering with it and not answering it because I was worried it would come across the wrong way to folks and stuff. But I wanted to address it because I understand where you're coming from, right? Which is like when, should, and I think I'd go deeper than that. Could almost like voters file a class action suit against maybe it's a sitting governor, maybe it's a sitting president, maybe it's the HHS, right? Does a group of Texans decide to file a class action suit against HHS and Secretary Kennedy for misleading people on the measles vaccine? Now, look, there's obviously indemnity in government. Government officials are supposed to be indemnified, and it's very hard to sue them on a personal basis. You could get to defamation and things like that. But I guess I would, I was trying to think of what would be an example of a suit that might get standing, right? Did a government official provide essentially mislead the public and it led to deaths, right? This would be the measles, right? Is there some standing there? So I guess my answer to this question is I think this would be difficult to make happen. I think there's elected officials have, particularly in Congress, have protection of the speech and debate clause. The First Amendment does sort of protect, you have a right to lie, you have a right to mislead. The question is maliciously, intent, there's defamation. Did you do your misstatements to purposely cause harm, right? There's sort of, you do have to connect it to motive there. But in coming up with an example, the one that would perhaps could have standing, and I'd be fascinated to see if there was a federal court that would take this and what the Supreme Court would say, is if a group of citizens in Texas sued Kennedy and HHS, essentially by saying that they helped enhance the measles outbreak, which have then caused this damage, loss of life, etc. So it would be on, I think, health statements that I think perhaps the government would be the most vulnerable on in something like that, especially if you can scientifically prove that they were just wrong on the facts. I mean, the Surgeon General of Florida is a massive misinformer on so many things on health. He's the one that's been trying to convince people to take fluoride out of water, misleading people about the damage fluoride could do. Like anything, if you just injected fluoride into your body at, a whole tube of toothpaste of it immediately or whatever it is, yeah, it could poison you, but that is not the amount of fluoride in water that is taking place. So I would love to see a class action suit about health advisories from the government that possibly could be something that would put them at risk. Certainly would be an interesting thing to watch unfold in the courts. Ask Chuck. All right, next question here comes from James E. Are there any realistic possibilities to stop gerrymandering? It gets tricky because this comes down to a state and county law thing, correct? For example, if Congress makes a law banning it, the states don't have to adhere to that. I feel that this problem could fix a lot of Washington by promoting more moderate candidates and more competitive races. Curious about your thoughts of what it would take to ban gerrymandering. So here's the problem. If you start banning, one person's gerrymander is another person's attempt at creating a competitive district. One of the hallmarks of our society over the last 20 years, gerrymandering was a gigantic problem in the 90s and the first decade of the aughts. And then we started self-sorting. Meaning, when I was growing up, I had no idea. Nobody had any idea whether you lived in a Republican neighborhood or a Democratic neighborhood, especially if you lived in sort of a mixed neighborhood like I did. It was sort of a middle-class neighborhood in what I call East Kendall. There is no East Kendall, but it was east of the Turnpike, for those of you keeping track of Miami geography. And, I think our block, I have no idea. My father was a bumper sticker guy, so he had a Bob Dole bumper sticker for the 88 race. So I'm sure that sort of I marked our house, but I don't really have a strong memory of anybody on either side. And people weren't sure what people's politics were on different things. Now there's this bit of cultural self-sorting where people want to live, whether it's in a similar ethnic group or with similar cultural ties. And so if you're trying to create, congressional districts that are competitive, you actually might need to gerrymander in order to create the competitive nature. So I'm not sure gerrymandering itself is something you want to ban. Now, I do think you could create guardrails on gerrymandering, right? And I think I've brought this up before where, there's always been this idea that the courts could come up with a formula. So for instance, let me give you a formula that I've wanted to test out, which is you take, in any decade, at the end of the decade, when you're trying to figure out how you're starting your apportionment, you take the last two gubernatorial elections and the last two presidential elections, and you put all four of those votes together and you split the DNR. And whatever it is, whatever that spacing is, if the party that has an advantage is at 52%, then no district can be 10 points greater than 52, for said party, that you can't make a district bigger than 62% advantage for party X. And if it's 55, then that number would expand to 65, right? You sort of create some sort of, no more than 10 points in one direction or the other based on the statewide partisan split over the last 4 statewide elections for the 2 executive offices in the state, governor and the presidency. That's a way to create a formula. I'm a data guy. I would love to just have rules that you would follow. It's math, and you go from there. The other idea, of course, is what I floated in my TED Talk, which is if you want to limit the damage that gerrymandering can do, and the fact that political leaders in a state can essentially, put the finger on the scale for one party or the other. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Republicans have an advantage, have the majority in Congress, not because of the voters that voted, but because of congressional districts that were redrawn in North Carolina and Florida. That's the margin for the Republicans. If they don't get those court order redraws that go their way, Democrats probably control the House, and we have a much different situation here with Trump and his attempt to govern. So I do think that gerrymandering as it stands now, and I think we have too many people per congressional district. 800,000 per congressional district is too many. There are only 13 cities that have a population of greater than 800,000. Okay, so that means we have 435 congressional districts that are that would be individually, bigger or as big as just about every major city in America, but for the top 13. Austin, Texas has just under 800,000. So that is not a community of interest. And when you have districts that big, it actually becomes easier to gerrymander. And I know nobody wants to put more members of Congress and more politicians in Washington, but I believe it or not, more democracy is better for the democracy, not less democracy. And if you want to get rid of gerrymandering or limit the damage gerrymandering is do, then we should expand the House. You don't need a constitutional amendment for this. This is just an act of Congress. Expand the House. We're at 1 per 400,000. You're going to have more communities of interest. By the way, 400,000 is the population of America's 50th largest city, which is Arlington, Texas. That's a suburb of Dallas. That is a community of interest. I expect there to be a member of Congress for Arlington, Texas. That makes sense to me. And the likelihood, if you have 881 districts rather than 435, it's just harder to slice and dice them. You're actually going to have more of everything. And it should create more diversity, a bit more small d democracy in the House. And yes, you're going to have a different class of people finally have an opportunity to run for Congress. It isn't going to be somebody or some ideology that you share with just enough people in order to break through with an interest group to get the nomination in a congressional district that only the primary would decide things. So if you're looking to get rid of gerrymandering, I don't think it is by doing a law as you're describing, because people move around and you never know when you're going to need to create gerrymander in order to create competition, right? So I do think the better answer is double the size of the House. Ask Chuck. All right, let me move on to the next question here. And this one comes from, it's unsigned. Longtime listener, first-time caller. I love that. You always like to talk about finding people in the middle, and I've always liked your description that most Americans live between the 30-yard lines, referring to a football field. But my question for you is, could you explain what you're measuring with that metaphorical football field? When you're talking about moderates, is it a question about tone, not being a bomb thrower, deference to process, policy incrementalism, people who try to triangulate some position that seems to appeal to some imaginary swing voter? Or is it really just about being pragmatic as opposed to seeming like a doctrinaire partisan dialogue? Yes. Okay. The answer is that. He goes on, which version are the people you think politicians need to speak to when you're talking about moderates, and which of these voices should the media try to find? Look, I am one of those who believes that I always say that I don't share I have, depending on the issue, some people might say my views are radically left or they're radically right or whatever, right? They don't. But what I always say is you can't sort of make progress without incrementally in the middle. It doesn't mean, I think there's 2 types of moderates. I think there's moderate in temperament, and then there's sort of moderate in that they have a mixed constituency and they're trying to represent maybe a business community on one part of their district, and maybe they're trying to represent a religious community in another part of their district, and maybe there's sometimes some things go together. But I'm mostly in for tone or tenor. I mean, I think that, there used to be Republicans tried to get the most electable conservative. I've heard some on the left describes himself as a pragmatic progressive, meaning they're always looking to make progress, but they're not trying to, they're not trying to solve the problem in one fell swoop. You know that in a country of 350 million people, with a lot of diverse opinions, you got to bring them along one step at a time. So when I speak about the 30s, it's not that people don't have some things that they may be further to the left than somebody and further to the right. It's just that they accept the fact that, hey, their point of view is out of that mainstream and isn't going to get addressed, but maybe there's something in between. So maybe you believe that all abortion should be banned, but you know that that's not a 70% issue. That in fact, that's a 70% issue against your point of view. So instead, you may be for parental notification, or you may be for, trying to limit the number of weeks somebody has access to abortion, because then you find yourself sharing the views of people somewhere in this larger middle. So when I refer to that, I do refer to, I think of it as that way, because I don't think anybody per se. I think people define themselves as centrist based on the caricatures of the two parties that are out there. But I actually think that isn't the issue. It really is more, I see it as more temperament, right? You have people that are going to take a sledgehammer to government, right? I mean, Donald Trump's no moderate here, even though he actually has positions that might not put him as an ideologue, traditional conservative on X or Y or Z, right? He's actually a protectionist, which in the 80s was considered a left-wing position. But he is not conservative at all in his mindset of trying to hurry up and change things, right? That is not, the first part of conservative is conserve, right? Which means you don't do anything too rashly. If anything, you incrementalism, but even smaller, right? On that front. So, look, you outlined it well, but that is usually what I'm referring to. It's not necessarily an ideological. It's more about temperament and whether you believe that, hey, the goal should be to give get a little something for everybody. A 70-30 win, if you're the party in majority, that's a win, versus this idea that the other side doesn't get any say at all. It's either 95-5, it's either my way or the highway. That to me is not a moderate position, even if if you have no interest in engaging with the other side. Ask Chuck. All right, the final question I'll take today is this. It comes from a guy named Rocky. Gotta love that. I always appreciate when you insert some sports knowledge into a political conversation. Based on your experiences, what elected official is the most knowledgeable sports fan you've interacted with? Disclaimer, former athletes or coaches like Jim Bunning, Steve Largent, Tom Osborne, they don't count. Extra points if you want to break it down: baseball, college football, NFL, college hoops, NBA, NHL, PGA. Enjoying the podcast, Rocky. So I got a couple of quick answers on this. I'll tell you, the person that Tom Davis, he's a former Republican member of Congress from Northern Virginia. He basically came to Congress when I got to the hotline. I think he won in 92 and then 94. Anyway, this is a guy who didn't just know every presidential result going back to the 48 presidential election by county. I think he could name every World Series lineup that goes back to 1948. Davis was a baseball savant, is a baseball savant. I've enjoyed going to Nats games with him in the past. If he's listening now, he might be. He's an old friend. Easily the most knowledgeable baseball fan of any elected official I've met. But you have these sort of specialists like Sherrod Brown. He's got this, I don't want to give away his email address, but his email address is a tribute to the tribe, to the Guardians now. I guess we refer to them. Massive Cleveland baseball fan and can go deep on Cleveland baseball. Not sure about the other sports. Steve Israel, former Long Island congressman, goes deep on the Mets. Just loves his Mets, can go super deep. Then there's I've always had some pretty good. Haley Barber, boy, does he love Ole Miss football. And that is somebody you can have a deep and long conversation on Ole Miss football. So, it's Marco Rubio can go. He's a guy that will go deep on the backup cornerbacks of the Dolphins. He's a super fan of the Dolphins in a way. And I'm not sure where I think his son's a Gator. And he went to, I'm not quite sure of his college football, how obsessed with college football he is. But I know he's a massive Dolphins fan and can go deep on the Dolphins on that front. So, this has been one of the more helpful ways as a reporter. I've always said, being a sports fan, there's always a way to connect. And I'm an eclectic sports fan. I like, baseball and college football are probably my two first loves, but boy, the NFL's right there. I love the NBA. My son loves it more. So I've gotten into it a little bit more. By the way, Barack Obama, that guy watches a ton of basketball. I remember I busted him. He wasn't a huge baseball guy, claimed to be a White Sox fan. And I remember one day there's some big trade the White Sox have. I was doing small talk. He wasn't paying attention to a Jake Peavy trade at the Chicago White Sox. But he's the guy that was going, did you see the backup guard that played the other night in the Bulls game? That guy, he played I watched him at Marquette. He goes deep both on college basketball and the NFL. Ironically, Donald Trump's not as, where he goes deep is golf. He weirdly doesn't go that deep on some of these other sports. He knows culturally he needs to connect, but as he will say, he's friendly with a lot of sports owners. But I know he loves boxing. He loves wrestling. Wrestling's been a good thing for his businesses in Atlantic City. He was the one guy that was willing to host the WWE back in the days, and that was an important, the snobs of Madison Square Garden weren't so into it back in the day, and it gave him a tenant when he needed a tenant. But he doesn't go as deep on the players on some of this stuff unless he has a personal relationship. But on golf, and I'll tell you, there's a reason golfers are so loyal to him. They will tell you, and I've had this conversation with golfers, even those that don't like his politics, they say, you don't understand. He really cares about making great golf courses. They've always felt very, very well treated by any Trump course. So, the golfing community isn't just formed to be for him. He has treated the golfing community quite well over the years because he wants more of these tournaments, right? The guy loves his golf. And he does go deep on that. So I will say this, it is whether you're into sports or not, if you're going to get into politics as an elected official, as a reporter, or as a staffer, you're going to have to learn how to speak that language. It is the best way to connect with communities. It is frankly, it is a way to bring communities together without, and especially, I wish Donald Trump didn't make this so difficult for people politically, sort of almost being negative if somebody doesn't come. Really would love to separate out the politics of the presidency so that plenty of teams could just feel good about showing up at the White House. I'm sorry that it is treated so politically these days. There were plenty of players that boycotted showing up for these events when Obama was president. But it didn't get, it's not like Obama got angry about it and said something and tweeted or whatever, right? And I think it's why it never seemed like it was as big of a deal as it comes across now, because the president himself, it personalizes everything into whether it's about him or not, as we know, in some ways he loves it if he can make something about him on that. But look, that's my rundown of sports fans. My friend Chris Saliza wrote a whole book about presidents and sports. It's really good. I highly recommend it. It's a good way to sort of get you acclimated with which politicians truly like sports and which politicians simply use sports as a way to try to connect to the everyday voter. All right. Well, that does it for that group. We got 4 questions in for Ask Chuck. We've been getting a lot. Be sure you can send me an email at askchuck@thechucktodcast.com. You can put a comment in the YouTube with a question. You can do it on our Instagram feed. You can send us questions wherever you want to send us questions. Instagram feed, Twitter, YouTube. Yes, I have a TikTok feed too for the ToddCast. Don't tell anybody at TikTok. No, actually, please do, so the algorithm can get better. So anyway, I would love to get your questions from that. And with that, I will take a break for at least 24 hours until we upload again.